By this point, I've mentioned the OSI layers multiple times, and we've actually gone into what each one of those layers are called. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at those and take a little more in depth into those layers, give some examples of what those layers, what protocols fit into each one of those layers, and talk a little more what happens in each one of those layers. So here is a summary of those different layers that we've been talking about. We've been talking about the layers 1 through 7 and the different names for these layers. And we've even given some examples of how different protocols that fall within each one of these layers. So this is a table you probably want to start getting familiar with. And as we get into the TCP/IP model, we'll realize that actually it looks a little different, but there's a lot of similarities. So it's important to know about these different layers, how they interact, but we are going to take a look a little bit later into some of the changes with them. So for now, though, you see some examples. Layer 7 is the application layer. It deals with just some examples is HTTP, FTP, and FS. We've talked about HTTP and FTP already in this class. Then there's the presentation layer, layer 6. And so some examples of that is AFP, Telnet, and NCP. So those are a few protocols that are examples of that. In 5, the session layer, NetBIOS, PAP, RPC, PPTP, all are examples that fall under the session layer. And so you're going to get familiar with these different protocols, some more than others. And it's not going to be as important with the layers 5, 6, and 7. But we are going to get really in depth into this transport. As I mentioned before, the TCP and UDP are the primary protocols we're going to be looking into. And there's a lot of cool stuff that happens that we're going to talk about in just a second, actually, that happens at this layer. And then layer 3, still some cool stuff that happens at this also. We have IP version 4, IP version 6, ICMP, which you'll get real familiar with ICMP or ping. And so layer 3 is the network layer. Layer 2 is the Ethernet, ATM, and frame relay. And we will take an in-depth look into Ethernet and how Ethernet functions, because that's where the majority of our local area networks are Ethernet nowadays. And then you get into the physical, a V.92, a USB, DSL, 100 base T. I tried to fit some in here that like USB, that's not typically for computer networking, but it's still a protocol that happens at this physical layer. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at the data types and visually kind of break this down as well. So let's talk about the data types, what happens to the data as it goes through these stages. And I'm going to give a little visual on what that visual looks like. First, let's do a quick review on encapsulation and what encapsulation is. Encapsulation is when we have data that needs to be moved from one location to another. We need to send some data with it, and we have some information that needs to go along with that. And so what we do is we encapsulate it. And what that could look like is it could look like we put a header on the front of this, and we put the data that we want to send over with this into the header. Or what we could do is we could put a trailer on this. So then we add information to the trailer. And in fact, as we are going to look at this, there's going to be actually a lot of headers that we're going to put onto our information that we're sending across. Depending on the layer that it is, it's going to get built up. And so here it is. We've got these first few stages of this, the first few layers of this. We just have data, and we're taking and we're manipulating that data. There's stuff that's happening in there, but it gets manipulated, especially if we're doing something like encryption and we're encrypting it. But the data is going to essentially be a block of data that we're changing. And the interesting part starts coming in when we get to the segment side of this. The segment is going to take that data, and the data a lot of times probably most of the time, is too big just to be sent over in one chunk. And so what we have to do is we have to break that data apart into segments. And so the data type here is actually called a segment. We're going to take the data and we're going to break it apart, and now we've got segments. And then those segments, when they get to the other side, they need to be reassembled. And so one of the things that has to go into those different segments is what order is that segment. So if we're sending multiple segments over to the other side, we need to number this. You know, this is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3. It's a little more complex in the numbering than that, but essentially that's what it's doing. So that way, when it gets over to the other side, it can take those segments and then it can reassemble that. So what we have right here is we have a TCP header that we include with that segment that we're going to send over. So that way on the other side, it has that information. There's a lot of other cool stuff that happens in this also. Like there's some error checking or acknowledgement that happens. And so a lot of things that are happening on this transport layer. Okay, then we have our network layer, or layer 3. The layer 3 is called a packet. And once again, we have an IP address that needs to go into this, so that way this packet can get to the other side, can be delivered to the other side. And so we have to put the IP address, both the sending IP address and the receiving IP address, into this packet before we send this. And so we have an IP header that we put onto this packet before it gets sent. And so that is layer 3 network. We call it a packet, and that's what gets sent over. So then we have the layer 2, or the data link layer. Layer 2, or the data link layer, we call that a frame. And this is the one that is going to exist only on the local area network. So it's going to attach this information just to get it to its next hop, its next area, and then once that happens, that information gets pulled off, new information gets put on to send to the next one. And so one of the things that happens at this layer is we have local addresses, or MAC addresses, what the next hop is going to be. There's actually MAC addresses is one of the types of addresses, but there is lots of other types of addresses that go into here as well. But that information needs to go into the frame so it can be sent across to whatever that next gateway is, that next hop, that next router. We'll talk about all of those terms as we go through here, but it just gets it to the next spot where it gets torn down and then reassembled. Another interesting thing about this is there is a check that happens in here, and so this has a frame trailer to it also that is a little check that gets put in there, so that way when it gets to the other side, it checks it to make sure it physically received it correctly and everything is accurate. And so we have both a header and a trailer on this one. So then we have the physical layer, the layer 1, and that's the bits. That's the 1s and 0s. That's what we're sending across the line. I'm kind of standing in the way right here, but that is what is getting sent across, is those bits, those 1s and 0s as it goes across the line. If you like my videos, please hit that like button because it really helps me out. And so what that is that could be the electrical pulses that are being sent across, the electrons that are being sent across that copper wire. Or it could be the pulses of light, the ons and offs of the light that's being sent down the fiber optics to send a signal down to the other side. Or it could be the wavelengths that are going through the air to communicate wirelessly to your different devices. So that's how all the layers work together, and it just builds all of that information up, sends it physically across that line, gets to the other side, and then it gets torn back down the other side to be, whether it's just the first couple layers to be rebuilt and then sent on, or it's then once it gets to the final destination, it'll go back through those layers so that way the data can be received on the other side and displayed on the other side.